Trade has always been part of the American experience, but has America lost sight of our founders' intentions? The Constitution states that Congress has the exclusive power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. The intent was for Congress to have the power to levy or lower tariffs whenever necessary. Unfortunately, this power has gradually shifted from Congress to the President and the executive branch. We have witnessed this with the latest trade deal sold to America, the 2020 United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. Unfortunately, this 2,410-page document is filled with red flags. Most alarming are items dealing with the transfer of power from Congress to transnational regional bodies, issues concerning morality which have nothing to do with trade, and most importantly, threats to our national sovereignty and independence. Let's dive in and see what America has signed on to. Chapter 23 provides workplace protections for, quote, gender identity and other LGBTQ, quote, gender-related issues. Under discrimination in the workplace, the U.S., Mexico, and Canada are required to implement policies protecting, quote, gender identity. Going further, you will find that all three countries agree to cooperate on addressing gender-related issues in the field of labor and employment, as well as addressing the opportunities of a diverse workforce, including promotion of equality and elimination of employment discrimination in the areas of age, disability, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity. In other words, a man applies for a job. He goes to the interview dressed as a woman. He then demands to be addressed as a lady. Now, if he demonstrates even the mildest capacity to do the job, the employer would be required to hire that individual or risk a lawsuit. How well do you think certain religious organizations and other persons with conflicting views will deal with the enforcement of this policy as the USMCA is rolled out? Chapter 23 also calls for the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining. If fully implemented, all employees in a particular industry or line of work may be forced to join a union and pay union dues. This may sound harmless, but if an employee doesn't agree with the union's politics, policies, or tactics, it won't matter, because under collective bargaining, joining the union is mandatory. Now, some argue that because of states' rights, individual states can refuse to comply with collective bargaining. However, the USMCA could void individual states' right-to-work laws by forcing Congress to pass national collective bargaining laws. In fact, Mexico was forced into doing this in 2019, potentially paving the way for the US and Canada to have universal collective bargaining laws. Next, in Chapter 26, which covers competitiveness, it establishes a competitiveness committee, which is made up of unelected contact points representing all three countries. The Competitiveness Committee promotes economic integration and development within the free trade area and to further enhance the competitiveness of the North American economy. This is extremely dangerous since the further economic integration of the US, Mexico, and Canada is a vital step to creating an economic union or North American Union, like the European Union. If America wants to remain free and independent, this should be a major area of concern. Becoming part of any economic union is one of the best ways for globalists to gradually strip away every aspect of American sovereignty. Another way is by allowing regional governing bodies such as the UN or the WTO to gain substantial power. Within the USMCA, Chapter 30 establishes the Free Trade Commission. This commission alone is set up to act as the administrative, regional governing body that can consider proposals to amend or modify this agreement. This is almost identical to the European Commission that runs the European Union. Imagine what will happen to the US if the Free Trade Commission has the authority to override Congress without Congress's consent. Meaning, just like the European Union, the USMCA Free Trade Commission could potentially impose on our country new laws, regulations, and standards in the areas of banking, our currency, the environment, fishing, e-commerce, and labor. On top of that, the Free Trade Commission, just like the Competitiveness Committee back in Chapter 26, will also be made up of unknown, unelected government representatives from all three countries. These representatives not only oversee that the many aspects and provisions of the USMCA are being implemented, they also oversee 19 committees, one of which is the Competitiveness Committee, and they are all made up of even more unelected representatives. The dangers don't stop there. Let's wrap things up by looking at Chapter 31, which deals with dispute settlement and some harmful loopholes. According to Chapter 31, if a dispute or problem arises under the agreement, the countries involved can take it up with a panel established by the Free Trade Commission, known as an international panel. The 5 members that make up this panel are appointed from the US, Mexico, and Canada, and are required to have experience in international law and international trade. Chapter 31 states that the panelists will be specifically required to interpret the USMCA in accordance with the customary rules of interpretation of public international law as reflected in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties done at Vienna on May 23, 1969. So what exactly is the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties? Here's one of those loopholes that will be making globalists and many at the UN smile. You see, back in 1969, the International Law Commission of the UN drafted this international convention for the purpose of regulating treaties between nations, and the Nixon administration signed it in 1970. But the US Senate never ratified it. That means the US is not bound to it. Unfortunately, the fact that the Senate never ratified the Vienna Convention won't matter, because Chapter 31 of the USMCA can now force America to comply with it. And this isn't the only loophole. Chapter 24 obligates our country to follow the controversial United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, better known as the Law of the Sea Treaty. Now, this treaty is something President Ronald Reagan refused to sign in 1984 because he saw the UN's desire to control everything in, under, and even above the sea as a way to promote world government. This is why the Senate has continually refused to ratify the treaty. Now, America can be forced to comply with the Law of the Sea Treaty, even though the Senate never ratified it. You see, in Chapter 24 of the USMCA, hidden within the footnotes of Article 24.18, it requires all 3 nations to base their fishing management practices in accordance with the Law of the Sea Treaty, as well as with other international UN conventions that relate to fishing and navigation. This is a huge sovereignty-sucking loophole, all in the name of protecting fish and other marine life. With the addition of this one treaty alone, the U.S. may witness the surrendering of its waterways and miles of coastal oceans over to UN international law. Theoretically, this will give the UN jurisdiction over everything in, under, and even above the sea. Now, how exactly does that benefit trade, let alone remotely relate to it? And if something that dangerous is only mentioned in the footnotes, what else could be hidden in the USMCA? It's for reasons like these why the US needs to get out of the USMCA. We can't allow world government bodies like the UN and WTO to take our nation's sovereignty through multilateral trade deals. It is a coordinated effort to integrate all 3 nations into a regional North American union, much like the European Union. The primary concern with the USMCA is not its economic impact, good or bad, but its potential ramifications for U.S. sovereignty. The United States can weather the storms of a bad economy or even a recession, but it cannot survive the loss of its sovereignty. Educate yourselves and others about what's in the USMCA. One tool that is especially helpful is the USMCA Issues Index. This PDF alphabetically lists many of the USMCA's major threats to our sovereignty and freedoms. You could also use the items on this list to evaluate the globalist nature of future trade agreements. In fact, the USMCA is just one of many overlapping alphabet soup agreements to ensnare us in a socialistic one-world government. With your help, let's generate enough pressure to convince Congress and the President to get us out of the USMCA and stop any other future trade agreements that would ensnare us in an economic union or one-world government.